What is better, to be born good or to overcome your evil nature through great effort? Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth and Nirn. Recently, I've been playing a lot of the Oblivion Remastered video game, and the thought occurred to me to make a video to see the similarities, and differences between Tolkien's works and the Elder Scrolls, just like I did with Game of Thrones some years ago. Now, on a scale of epicness and complexity, I think the Elder Scrolls makes a very compelling case for being one of the heirs of the Legendarium. Although the moral complexities and other aspects of the Elder Scrolls are different than Middle-earth, the world building and complexity of high fantasy are quite legendary, just like Tolkien's. Really fast before we begin, stay tuned for the end of the video for a giveaway from a great artist and a friend of the channel, Rinus. And check out our new channel, Masters of Mythology, for content like this on a bunch of different myths. My friends, thank you all for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. To begin, let's look more at the similarities between the differences. Now, this video will be much more of a conversational kind of video. We're going to go through the different topics, and not super into depth, because I honestly don't know the Elder Scrolls lore nearly as well as Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and all of that, of course, but I think I do have an understanding of the Elder Scrolls well enough. I've played Oblivion a lot, even before the remaster, Skyrim, and a bit of Morrowind, not too much, but I've delved a lot into its lore recently. So again, this is kind of overall broad themes and topics instead of more of an in-depth lore breakdown with the Elder Scrolls. There are plenty of great YouTubers out there that do that. That's where I've learned a lot of my info. So, alright, let's jump into the similarities between Middle-earth and the Elder Scrolls. First off, at a very surface level, they're both obviously high fantasy and have a lot of complexity, right? If you're looking for Silmarillion-esque world building and culture building, language building, things like that, look no further than the Elder Scrolls. Because honestly, going through any of the games, going through the in-game books, right, the frame narratives within the video games themselves, or even just reading like the Wikipedia pages, you will see how much and how deep the lore of the Elder Scrolls, of Nirn, of all of this stuff goes. It's insane. Especially some of the older stuff. Skyrim has some complexities and plays on some difficult to understand topics for sure, and it's really good stuff, but I will say that I tend to agree that if you look back at like Oblivion and then especially Morrowind, it gets way more complex. When you talk about Morrowind, you have like these figures that became false gods because of the betrayal that they did a long time ago, and the tools of a dwemer, dwarf kind of elf, that they used for their own ends, and then this Azura said to them that she would make a reincarnation to come and fight them of this guy called the Nerevarine, who's this hero and all this, like, it's incredible, and I've probably even gotten some of that a little bit blotched up because it is complicated, but you can easily get lost in this deep Silmarillion-esque lore, and honestly, it's pretty dang good. When you understand everything that's going on through the games and you get to some of these plot elements and some of these moments, it's really amazing. So, I mean, speaking of the different peoples, right, speaking of the Dwemer, the races, and again, just the overall sort of world building and culture building are very Tolkienian in many ways, but even pushes the complexity, right? I would say Tolkienian elves are more similar even amongst their kindreds, even amongst the Noldor, the Sindar, or the Teleri rather, and so forth, right? You have a lot more similarities even between these houses of the elves than you do between the High Elves, the Wood Elves, and the Dark Elves, who also have their own other names in the Elder Scrolls. Also the Dwemer, who are dwarves, but like, they're actually elves in Elder Scrolls, but they were dwarven elves, more or less, that disappeared before pretty much all these games, sometime in their lore, right? And people have all these conspiracy theories about what happened to the Dwemer, what happened to them, because you explore so many of their ruins throughout the games, but the ideas surrounding their disappearance are just so incredible and so enigmatic, in kind of almost like a what happened to the Blue Wizards kind of way. So really cool mysteries as well as in the Elder Scrolls, such as that. But yeah, you have orcs. Now orcs, this is where we get into a little bit of differences, which I'll touch on later, but orcs are much more sympathetic, right? They have the same sort of personalities, but they're humanized in the Elder Scrolls in a way that they're not in Middle-earth. To be honest, right, I've talked about this with Rings of Power. Humanizing orcs hasn't really been an issue for me in Middle-earth. Like, I don't really think that how Tolkien wrote them, that they need that. But for some people that might sympathize with a D&D type of orc, or an Elder Scrolls kind of orc, right? These Elder Scrolls games and the lore really has a lot of that humanization. Humans, even Nords, Redguards, Imperials, Bretons, they all have a lot of different culture and backgrounds amongst them as well in the lore. Right, the culture's very similar in that high fantasy-esque kind of way, but yeah, pretty cool for sure. Then, of course, we have these religious magic beings that I kind of alluded to earlier with Azura. You have, just like how you have the Maiar and the Valar in Middle-earth, in Elder Scrolls, they are definitely a lot more, shall I say, influential directly in the deeds of mankind and in the deeds of Nirn, the world, than maybe they are in Middle-earth. Middle-earth, they definitely take a back seat when it comes to certain things. But in Nirn, they are very, very involved. Now, obviously, with Melkor and Sauron, they got very involved. But here we have a lot of gods and a lot of Daedra, almost kind of, some of them, at least, kind of demon-esque, but not quite. And even many of the gods, like who you see as good, who you see as bad, which we'll get to in the differences as well, is definitely shaken up. And so it's not good, gods, good guys all the time, and Daedra, as they're called, bad guys all the time, or demons all the time. You definitely have this complexity, but you have all of these religious, high-powered forces that are influencing the character that you play and the characters that are around you. Now, how they influence you is you will go and do like a quest for a certain Daedra, and they might reward you with like their artifact, and you'll use this artifact in your adventures, sometimes to do heroic deeds, and sometimes to just rain havoc down on everybody. Depends on the Daedra, depends on the artifact, and depends on how you are role-playing that character. But these kind of religious conflicts are certainly at the heart of most of the Elder Scrolls. We'll talk about something else too, but I mean, how people interact with the Daedra, how people interact with the gods, really more or less defines the story as it is. And sometimes you can even become divine as it is. Definitely a departure from Tolkien, right? Where for the most part, you don't have characters that really can do that. Again, a couple exceptions. We'll talk about that in the differences section. Moving on to another similarity, Sean Bean. I mean, Sean Bean's in Oblivion as one of the main characters, and then Sean Bean's obviously Boromir. So he's a similarity that I wanted to point out. Speaking of Sean Bean, speaking of a hero, right? Skyrim, Oblivion, Morrowind, Daggerfall, and I think Arena, right? A lot of these stories, they take you through not exactly an archetypal hero's journey, but something close to it. I mean, it's a high fantasy, so they want to give you those moments of you're a great good versus a bad evil, but then the main side quests, right, the faction side quests, which are more or less like, Dark Brotherhood, an Assassin's Guild, a Thieves Guild, a Fighters Guild, or like the Companions in Skyrim, or the Mages Guild, they'll give you this sort of moral complexity. Again, we're definitely getting closer to that as a conversation here, but they give you a hero's journey, but they also can give you parts of a villain's journey. Overall, if you do the main quest, you're a hero in Skyrim or Morrowind or Oblivion. You just are that hero. But that doesn't mean you'll not do some screwed up things along the way. You definitely will if you follow a lot of the quests. So that's kind of an interesting thing, a bit of a departure, right? If you play Lord of the Rings Online or you play Battle for Middle-earth or something like that, like a Lord of the Rings based game, you'll find that for the most part, you're doing like good deeds all the time, right? So, world-altering artifacts, kind of like how we have the One Ring in Middle-earth, or the Silmarils. You have just these powerful Daedric or godly artifacts, as well as Daedric or godly villains and heroes, maybe to help you out along your quest. But it really places the player at the center of it, as if you were someone at least renowned like Aragorn or Gandalf, right? Someone of great, immense power, probably even more powerful than they are, but also someone it's your story, right? So Elder Scrolls has all of that going. Again, when it comes to world building, when it comes to playing a hero in a fantasy story, all of that, it really can feel very similar to Middle-earth in many ways. Now, let's get into the differences. And as I've kind of prefaced with even some of the similarities, there are a lot of differences. In fact, probably as many differences as similarities. But again, aesthetically, it feels kind of like Middle-earth. You go through Cyrodiil, you go through Tamriel, and it feels like you might be wandering somewhere in Middle-earth. But there is a lot to be said here. So let's jump into it. The moral complexity is certainly different. As you guys got from that quote from the dragon Paterson at the beginning of the video, there is a lot of shifting morality and change. Even how virtue itself is more or less discussed, I suppose, or at least mentioned in a game kind of way. You're, let's say, the Dragonborn, but yeah, you're also the head of an assassin's guild, the Dark Brotherhood. It's hard to say that you're very good or very evil, but again, if you defeat the great evil Alduin who's trying to eat the world, okay, well, yeah, that's good, but then you killed a bunch of innocent people. Maybe that's not so good. So there's that moral complexity, and it doesn't take morality certainly as serious. In this way, it feels a little bit more like mythology, because you're doing these crazy grand things, but you're not always a good guy, unless you roleplay your character like that. But you're also not really like a bad guy all the time, unless you maybe roleplay your character like that. It's kind of up to the player, but if they do all the quests, there's definitely going to be some gray mixture of all of this in between. So there is that. It doesn't take virtue and morality as necessarily seriously as Tolkien does. That is definitely a very Tolkienian aspect of our heroes being very good guys. In many ways, being born more or less good. Like, are they tempted? Sure, sometimes. But in Elder Scrolls, it's a little different. Again, it feels a little bit more cynical, a little bit less serious, a little bit more humorous in a way. Of just like, oh, yeah, I'm this grand wizard, the head of the Mages Guild, and I'm this great warrior that everybody respects throughout the land, the head of the Warriors Guild. But at the same time, like, you know, that very same character might be the worst criminal that Tamriel has, like, ever seen. That's kind of crazy to have that back and forth as an Elder Scrolls character. Right, you play Lord of the Rings Online, it's nothing like that. You are a hero through and through, and as most of Tolkien's characters are. So, yeah, I mean, that is definitely an interesting change. But then, even as I mentioned with, like, the almost demonic ones, so the Daedra versus Aedra. Aedra is, like, the ancestors of the Elven people, and Daedra is not their ancestors. Again, I even still get it confused because I guess they're not even necessarily the opposite of gods, but sometimes in the game they can feel that way. So you have all of these like divine beings, and some of them are like not necessarily bad guys. Some can be good, some can be neutral, some definitely are, right? In Oblivion, you're fighting one of the like worst Daedra, who's more or less just like this demonic giant destroyer of planes, Mehrunes Dagon. And, but then there are other Daedra that'll help you out, or like give you an item if you just help them do something or protect their shrine, right? So it is very interesting, because even then, in the next game, right, you might have a Daedra who was very bad, be not so bad, not as bad anymore. Still maybe retain some of their evil, but it's like they're not the world-ending threat that they were. So Mehrunes Dagon in Skyrim, still evil for sure, but like he's not trying to actively invade and overthrow the entire world. Right? Somebody else is trying to do that. So, morality is very complex in Elder Scrolls. So we should definitely keep that in mind. Speaking of the religious and powerful figures, another giant change, or difference rather, not change, but difference from Tolkien is that how mortals and the divine actually interact. So again, like I kind of presented earlier, you can't really ascend to godhood in Middle-earth. The closest I would say, have to that is Eärendil, ascending into the sky because the Valar let him, and carrying one of the Silmarils. But the thing is like, while that's definitely a symbol, and it in some ways feels religious for the elves, it is different than how it works in the Elder Scrolls. In the Elder Scrolls, you have characters like Tiber Septim or Talos, who is this godly general of a man, kind of, a horrible conqueror, depending on who you talk to. But many of the Nords and Imperials and all of these guys respected him, and he ascended into godhood. He ascended from Tiber Septim into Talos and became this godly figure, but then is disputed by the elves, the high elves, I should say, in particular the Thalmor, who outlaw that kind of worship of Talos because he was just a man. Right? You have that kind of intriguing complexity. But then, in Middle-earth, let's say an equivalent kind of figure, Elendil, right? Elendil never ascends. He never becomes more than... Is he like one of the greatest men of all time? Absolutely. Is he this just king, high king among men? He is different than normal mortals? Sure. But he never ascends to this divine position. So how that kind of works and how power just generally works is certainly different in Middle-earth versus the Elder Scrolls. Also, the Elder Scrolls gets into some interesting, almost Lovecraftian concepts, psychology and psychological, sometimes philosophical, but I'd say in many ways Middle-earth is more concerned with that than the Elder Scrolls can be. But at a time, there's this concept in the Elder Scrolls called the Godhead, where really maybe the whole world is just a dream in some godly figure's mind, and realizing that might cause you to wake up or something. Right, you have that versus Middle-earth, more or less, it is reality. It is the world that is, Ea, right, the universe that is. So you don't really have as much of that. For one last major difference here, and again, there's much more to be said about all of this. This is just kind of an introduction. If anyone wants me to follow up with another video comparing more similarities and differences, just let me know in the comments below. But the last one I want to go into here is the magic systems in Lord of the Rings or Middle-earth versus the Elder Scrolls. So we kind of know Middle-earth has a super soft magic system. I mean, we don't really know how much of it works. Even all these years later, we don't really know how, what powers Gandalf has as a wizard and what that exactly means, all of that kind of stuff, right? I've made plenty of videos discussing all of that, and I just made a magic one a couple weeks ago. So check that out if you want. But with Elder Scrolls, there are some things, artifacts, right, that are soft magic, but for the most part, I would say it's hard magic, right? You can go in Skyrim, you pretty much already know basic spells, and it's kind of commonplace to see a firebolt or a lightning, shock thing, or, people using magic, elemental spells, runes, necromancy, or restoration magic, alteration, illusion magic, all this kind of stuff. That's kind of commonplace in the Elder Scrolls. And honestly, kind of like with D&D, I think that can be cool. I think if you let it get out of hand, magic certainly will, in a literary and in a fantasy story kind of setting. If you let magic go run amok, it will. And so with Tolkien, even though he obviously used soft magic, and we don't exactly know how it works, he used it very sparingly, and it still required quite a lot of power and almost divine power in many instances, or other sorts of kind of how the author wanted it to work, moments, right? It required situations that were very specific for it to work as it did, right? So it never really ran amok. But in Skyrim and Oblivion and in the Elder Scrolls generally, it doesn't really run amok, but yeah, it's much more commonplace. And yet it also seems weaker, because it's most spells, right? As you get into these higher levels and see certain things happen, right? There's very powerful magic, for sure. But for the most part, the commonplace stuff is as common as seeing someone draw a sword or a bow, which I think is kind of cool, but it's certainly different than with Middle-earth. So, again, let me know what you all think. Certainly different styles of high fantasy here, and yeah, let me know what you all like about Elder Scrolls, Lord of the Rings, what you like about both of them, more so than like a compare and contrast of which is better. I love them both, so let me know why you do too. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts on these two works in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share this if you enjoyed it. Let me know if you'd like to see a part 2 or a different comparison. There's plenty to kind of compare and contrast in terms of similarities and differences for Middle-earth and all these other fantasies and video games and systems of magic, all of that good stuff. So let me know in the comments below. Our friend Rinus made a very detailed and beautiful Rivendell piece of art, and he wants to give away the first of a limited release amount of prints. To enter into our giveaway, comment and tell me your story with Middle-earth and the Elder Scrolls, how both changed your life, and some fond memories that you have of both, right? Everybody has their Skyrim stories. Okay, maybe not everybody, but most anyone who's played video games has their Skyrim stories, and we all obviously have our Middle-earth stories. So let me know yours in the comments below. How have these two different properties, franchises, I guess, changed your life for the better? Let me know, and I'll choose a comment for Rinus's giveaway. I'll let you know in the comment. You'll have 24 hours to respond to me at menofthewestst@gmail.com with your own email, and we'll get you set. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, who just came out with some new candles based on members of the Fellowship, or order some Weather United Cutlery, Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon. It does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout, and please check out our merch. Join our memberships and Patreon for access to our Discord and our monthly podcast. Another episode is coming soon. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Todes Morgen, Joby Weasel, Ed Patterson, ComicNut64, Zoomi, Peter Sheppard. Thank you all so much for continuing to keep the channel going. My friends, thank you all so much for joining us on this adventure. Don't forget to subscribe to join the Men of the West, and until the next one, my friends.